Thank you for those wonderful remarks from Ramon LaGuarta, CEO of PepsiCo. I'm going to add more hashtags to your hashtag mix if you didn't have enough already. I said to tag AABR. I got 3 hashtags for you. AABR 2022. That's your first hashtag. Second, hashtag new majority. That's your second one. And third is hashtag AABDC. I know that's hard to get it all in on Twitter, but you can figure it out, I promise you. Please continue to post to social media. We want to really raise awareness of this important day and this important conversation. My other housekeeping items, remember that there are volunteers that are here, that are all around. If anyone needs any assistance, seek out the volunteers, and they are here to help you. Oh, one last housekeeping item. The bios for all of our presenters are in your program, and so we won't be delving deep into everyone's impressive bios, not the least of which by ways of introduction, but you can get more information on everyone in the program that's before you. So let's get the party officially started with our first panel discussion. And this is an important topic to kick off the day's events and set the tone for the dialogue we'll be having across the day. So first up is a discussion among the leaders of the key new majority communities. I want to invite to the stage the panelists and the moderator of our first panel discussion, and that will be moderated by Dr. David Wu, who is Baruch College's 8th president, but I would also add he is the first Asian American to lead a college throughout the entire City University of New York system. So give this panel a round of applause to come to the table.
Wow, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, it's a great honor for me to be here moderating this distinguished panel. We're going to start by a very brief introduction of each one of the panel members. And I'm going to start from my left, Mr. Michael Garner. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Michael J Garner. I'm the chairman of the founding chapter of the 100 Black Men of New York, founded by great leaders such as Congressman Charlie Rango, the late great Mayor David Dinkins, baseball great Jackie Robinson, and other Black leaders of that day. In my day career, I'm the Vice President, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at that little organization called the MTA. And my role with my staff of 60 people is to make sure that the workforce of the MTA is reflective of this great diverse region that we serve of 14 counties. In addition, making sure that all of our employees have the ability to work in a bias-free environment. And third, and a major focus on the empowerment of certified minority-owned businesses. And the MTA, out of 97 state agencies and authorities, are ranked #1 with dollars paid to minority women-owned businesses. Last year, that number exceeded $1.5 billion in 1 year. And the reason why that's important from a equity perspective is access to contracts equals home ownership opportunities, better education opportunities, and better healthcare options.
Thank you. Frankie?
My name is Frankie Miranda. I'm the president and CEO of Hispanic Federation. The Federation is a membership organization supporting Latinx organizations providing direct services in the health and human service spectrum. We are a capacity building, we're a grant maker, and right now we're supporting organizations in 41 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we launched the largest Latinx COVID-19 relief effort, supporting close to 500 organizations at this time. We were created in 1990 with my sister organization, the Asian American Federation.
Joanne?
Hi, I'm Joanne Yu. I'm the executive director of the Asian American Federation. They didn't tell me that I had to wear a black suit today. So, just saying. But we are indeed, Frankie, Hispanic Federation, Asian American Federation. We were founded together. We're sister organizations. We call each other the Federation siblings. We do what Frankie does, but at a much smaller scale, certainly, due to population. We lead about 70 organizations that serve in the health and human sector. It's we've unfortunately had to lead all the work around anti-Asian hate for the last 2 years. It's been a devastating time for our community, but I think these conversations are really important. I think, as siloed as we are, I think we also need to figure out how do we move out of all of this, living in our own worlds, and really figure out how do we, as we emerge out of COVID, how do we really build an equitable world that includes all of us and that leadership looks like all of us. Last time I saw David, we were having hot pot.
That's right. Enjoyed it very much. So let me introduce myself a bit. I'm, as Dr. Pinkett mentioned, I'm the president of Baruch College. And one of the reason I'm honored to be here, Baruch is one of the most diverse colleges here in the United States. And we are one of the very few institutions that's both Asian and Pacific Islander serving institution as well as a Hispanic serving institution. And about 41% of our student body are actually Asian or Asian American. And so in that environment, of course, many of the issues that we'll be talking about today is very much front and center, not only for our student body, but in many ways for our mission and what we're trying to accomplish and the population of people we're trying to lift. So this is a great honor to be here, and I'm so glad to see that we have three very important organizations represented here: the 100 Black Men, Hispanic Federation, Asian American Federation. This is certainly not an accident, and also speak volumes about the attention of why allyship matters and why it's important and why is that the way for us to move forward. And I really like what Dr. Pinkett said at the beginning in terms of this is about how do we learn more about each other. And I think this is, I know many of the effort that has been put forward in doing exactly that, and hopefully we could push that even further in terms of not only learn about each other, but learn about each other's agenda and figure out the action items that we share and how do we move forward with. He mentioned about responsibility and opportunity, right? So many of us think about allyship in multifaceted ways, and I think this is a great way to frame it. It's not only all about responsibility to think about allyship and how do we lift each other up, but also look for the opportunities. And when we do this, what are the opportunities that open up for us, and in my case, for our students and for the people who are trying to educate, and so on and so forth. And so to frame the panel a little bit, as you all heard, that some of the origins of allyship and which maybe started this conversation many, many years ago, but got a lot of attention in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement. And then in 2021 in the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and there are this idea of allyship has also in some ways hit some challenges, and I would cite one of the New York Times article by the title of "Allyship Reaches an Awkward Stage." And I guess the byline basically says that allyship peaked as a hot term during 2020, and since then its meaning and impact have been complicated by questions over what it looks like in action and what is the performative or real. And it also cited some of the leaders, IGM Poo, for example, the founder of National Domestic Workers Alliance, said it quite well. Real allyship is when the spotlight isn't on and when you are not in a moment. And what are you doing to help strengthen the ecosystem of leadership that make movement possible? And I would argue this is exactly the type of things that we're trying to do here. And another comment from M.N.I. Chaney from Harriet's Wildest Dreams: fear of shame or saying the wrong thing often outweigh fear of status quo, leading to inaction. And so these are some of the challenges and the realities that we're facing, and this is exactly what we're here to talk about in this panel. So I'll start with the first question, and I'm going to ask our panelists to jump in. I know this is not a shy group. And the first question is really about what does allyship mean for each of you, and what does it look like, and why is it important? And further on, you have some thoughts about what is the cost of the status quo or not doing anything. So I guess I'll start with anyone who wants to jump in first on that first question.
Well, I'm going to defer to the lady.
Sure.
Yes.
I knew he was looking at me. Happy to jump in. So, for the Black, Latino, Asian community, solidarity is a lived experience for us. And I think, I think about what now our AG James has said. We're the minority majority. And we have a long history of working together. Frankie and I started, Hispanic Federation, Asian American Federation started this city council funding called Communities of Color Nonprofit Stabilization Fund, because our three communities have a lot of nonprofits, but we get no money from the city. So we started a program asking the city council for money that supports infrastructure in our community. And that infrastructure is to serve our community, but also because we hire from within our own community. There's a long history, the budget fight is going on. I saw the ask yesterday from my staff, and I was like, oh, we're asking for more money. This is great. We've really grown from 2 million when we used to ask. And I think what people see, right, from the public is very different than what is happening with leadership and behind the scenes. And I will admit, we need to be better at saying all these things very, very publicly, right? And the Asian American Federation, we have come out with statements, but we've always, I find that kind of a weird conversation, right? Because I've never not known a time when I didn't work with the Communities of Color Nonprofit is Asian American Federation, Coalition for Asian American Children, Hispanic Federation, New York Urban League. This has been
It's going to be in the 8th year.
Exactly, and it's this blood oath that we've made to fight for our communities. But there are other opportunities that we've had. During the pandemic, there were some conversations about who was going to get food funding, right? And I was the only person of color on that call, and I said, this is really weird because I know who's dying because they don't have the resources. So I'm calling Frankie, I'm calling Arva from New York Urban League. Why are you not on this call? What call? On this call to figure out why our communities are not getting funding to do food delivery for our seniors. These are the conversations that we have off the record all the time, and there is very much that we go and we go together. That is the mentality that we've always had. And so in every way, when there are tragedies in our communities, I know who to call. And before I even make a call to anybody, they call me first. And so I appreciate this question. And I realize that as we talk about all of this stuff, there's so many moments I can think about where oh my God, this is, for the Asian American community, all the Asian hate. There have been very, very strong friendships and allyships, people who've gotten me over that hurdle because, and I'll say, some of the folks who've, made sure that I was okay, they were not from our community. They were from my Black and Latino family members who, said, what do you need from us? No questions asked. And that was always, always solidarity. But, the next question as we come out of all of this, the violence in our city, I think about the next thing we have to do together is to figure out how do we stop saying Asian, Latino, Black, white, is how do we start to really think about the majority, minority, and to start to do real work together like we have done for all these years.
And I think that you have this is a great point to start. It's our sector, the nonprofit sector, the civil rights groups, the advocacy groups, have been doing this already for decades, right? What I find interesting is when companies, the private sector or government, struggle, or even the foundation sectors, struggle to understand the importance of lifting communities of color equally. We cannot be having these knee-jerk reactions that have been happening since the pandemic started, right? Where companies or foundations, that they have their own timeline and they're important in the ecosystem, but they basically are just basically saying to certain groups, well, this is not your time because we need to deal with this emergency, making grandiose commitments that then we see very little progress or performance around it, while we are struggling to make sure that our communities are well served. And also the other important thing about allyship is that we need to understand and resist the impulse for people that people have of trying to find simple solutions to complex problems. There was a time after the horrible murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that our country had, in which people suddenly said, okay, let's have this conversation about racism. Hispanics are racist too. And I was saying, like, we can have this conversation when we also understand and have a deeper conversation about our complex histories with slavery, genocide, colonialism, and the economic, political, and societal elements that force them, or they have to leave their countries and come here to try to understand a new system of oppression that forces all of our communities to fight for the limited resources in education, housing, healthcare, and then people basically said like, oh, but you guys don't have it, you guys are fighting, communities are racist. It's like, we need to understand that by design, this is what this system wants us to do. And allyship, it just basically breaks away from that and basically says, we're working together and we're going to move progress, and the future of this country, it's in the hands of these type of allyship and understanding communities. But I also want to warn everybody here that what we're doing here is considered by some people extremely radical and dangerous. There is this new concept being moved around that was used by the shooter in Buffalo about this great replacement theory that we are somehow plotting to take over the country, when the reality is that this is just fueled by certain media outlets, and then people that do not understand what is really happening in this country are trying to just use that as an excuse for their hate, to just spew hate. So why is important allyship? Because when at the beginning of the pandemic, there was all of these push to basically say the Asian American community was to blame for the virus. John Wang called me and called Michael and said, we need to say something. And we were just like on the beginning of the pandemic, basically saying, this type of rhetoric and hate will not help anyone solve this public health crisis. And here is an Asian man, a black man, and a queer Latinx person basically saying, we're not going to stand for this. And that is what is allyship, and that is why it's so important. And we have been doing it for a while.
And I would say, let me just give a special shout out to John Wayne, who has the courage and a vision to bring us all together, year in and year out, day in and day out, month in and month out. And allyship to me means simply what Bob Marley sung, is that we are one. We are one. If you look at the black community, the Asian community, and the Spanish community, we all have a commonality from a historic point of view. And what is that? Free and cheap labor. Free and cheap labor. We live in the greatest country in the world, which is one big experiment. It is an experiment of blue states versus red states, black, brown, Asian, whites. We went through a civil war where more than 700,000 people were killed. We are an experiment. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. But there's a singer also that was from the 1960s and 70s by the name of Curtis Mayfield. And he said, this is our country also. This is my country. We've been here since 1619. And if you look at the expansion of this company, All of the ethnic groups come here for a better opportunity and a better life, but we have been discriminated against. When you talk about violence towards Asians right now, which is despicable, right? People simply trying to be part of a great society, and other people are harassing them. Blacks, we've been lynched, captive in slavery since 1619, from 1619 to 1865. A short period of prosperity, and then the rise in 1906 of the Klan. And we fought for our civil rights and only got our right to vote in the 1960s because of racial rights. But, you know, we are just one big experiment. So thank you, John, but we are one. And so when one of us are impacted, all of us are impacted. And it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to support each other, because, you know, when we start talking to each other as opposed to at each other, we understand that we all have the same common needs to be able to thrive in this great society that we live in.
Thank you. And to pick up on some of the insight that have been shared by our panelists, that our second question is maybe turning slightly inward to our own community. And the question is, in your opinion, how do we make allyship desirable in our respective communities, and what are some of the shifts in the mindset currently that would be prevalent among our own communities, and how would that could be used as a leverage or potentially a barrier that for what we're trying to accomplish here?
Michael spoke about how an agency can actually transform the lives of people, right? When you have a concept of like a real commitment to diversity, when people see that they are being supported, that they understand that diversity in practice works, that we constantly see that we have abilities to uplift each other. I think that is when people really click and say, I have to survive, right? I have to survive. I am right now struggling economically. We were talking about fare evasion, for example, and we were saying like there are people that are really struggling still in the city, and it's not about whether or not one is struggling more than the other. It is about really finding opportunities to put in place not more than commitments, but real solutions that actually not target just one community, but that actually elevate all communities at the same time. I like to compare COVID-19 as, you know, when we were all locked up and many of members of our communities still had to work to keep us safe. But we were locked up and we were watching TV and we were glued at home, and it was almost like COVID pulled this curtain and forced everybody to see all of these disparities that we have been talking about for forever. But people suddenly had to just look straight in the eye about what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, and what was happening with Asian hate, and what was happening with the disproportionate impact on the Latinx community and others. But then now people want to go back to pre-pandemic times and pull back the curtain. No, and it's our responsibility to say we were not okay before the pandemic, right? We need to aspire to have a more fair and equitable society for this recovery. And that is why when we work together and we demonstrate that we can actually elevate each other, then we're going to have people understanding from their community that they don't have to struggle or fight somebody else, that we need to do this all together.
And I think the reality is the Black, Latino, Asian community, you know, we've always been under-resourced. And under-resourced in every way means that we have been invisibilized. For the Asian American community, you know, we all know about the model minority myth, but that is exactly what that is. It's a myth that is created, and that's been used as a wedge to harm Black and Latino siblings. And I think this is a time we need to say, no, this is not acceptable. And Frankie talked about the Buffalo shooter in his manifesto. He had some line about admiring the Asian American community, and I thought, I am just beyond horrified by that. Like, no, please, no. We don't want anything to do with you. We are not a community that says we're going to go out and gun down 10 people in a grocery store in a black neighborhood and to use, to express some admiration. I think these are the times when we need to also step up. We know that there's a lot of conversations that we need to have within our own communities. But I think there are times when we can share universal anguish and universal shock and frustration. And it's okay to say we are horrified by people using us to be able to justify hateful acts. That's not all right. And I think when we think about survival of why we need to get together, because that's how we're going to survive, literally. Frankie and I served on a lot of different task forces together over the pandemic. Every task force we were always on, and we were always texting each other as we were Zooming. And the small business task force, we talked a lot about, we try to get the Black and the Latino and Asian leaders together, because we were also talking about, so what do we have in common, right? We are definitely under capital, we don't have enough resources. We don't get the big contracts. We are really struggling. We're mom and pop shops. From the small businesses in our communities are literally, being held together through spit and bubble gum, because there isn't like a big, bunch of money behind them to support this. But yet those small businesses are the ones who are keeping our neighborhoods afloat. And especially during the pandemic, we were aware of, how challenging it was for them. So we were trying to figure out, how do we start to convene people together to have conversations about shared resources, shared struggles, to be able to have people talk about different ideas that they can, is there like shared buying power that they can have? And I think, that it was really hard to organize that conversation, because I think people are still struggling to figure out what is happening in their own communities. But yeah, absolutely, that, what Frankie's saying is right, that there are, there's a lot of conversations we need to have. And yeah, people are gonna think we're being radical, and I feel like, oh my God, I'm so moderate, these days. I used to think I was super progressive, but now I'm like moderate auntie. But this is a conversation, these conversations need to happen all the time. And it's okay to say, here are all the things that I don't know. But one thing for the Asian American community, I hope that we will say, for all the reasons of, we are not flattered by the model minority myth. No, we're not gonna keep our head down and struggle through all of this stuff, because our community needs help too. In fact, when we did the study about how much city contracts Asian American community gets, when we were 15% of the population, now we're 18, but when we were 15% of the population, we got 1.4% of the contract dollars, and it's an outrage. And when I think about that, it is the fact that, we are invisible, and yet, we're told, oh, you guys can make do because you're smart and you're resourceful and you never complain. We need to complain, because it's unfair. People are literally starving to death, and people are afraid to leave their homes, right? But to use our pain and use that marginalization to harm other communities, when the Black and Latino community says we need resources, they're told, oh, be like the Asians, right? And I'm thinking like, what BS is that, right? And so I think we need to recognize how we are being used. And I think we need to say, no, this is the line in the sand that we need to draw, to say we stand in allyship, because in order for society to be better, we need to stand together.
And maintaining the status quo leads to chaos. When you look at the racial unrest of the 1960s, if you look at the racial unrest because of the post-George Floyd movement, government has an obligation of bringing parity to a system. It's amazing to me how we are sitting in the Fortune 500 capital of the world right now, where billions of dollars of transactions are taking place every day. And if I was to get in my car and drive up Madison Avenue through Harlem and drive over the 138th Street Bridge, the Bronx is the third poorest county in the country. I didn't say the state. The Bronx is the third poorest county in the country, The first one is some county in Mississippi. Second one is one county in North Carolina, the Bronx. How do we bridge the gap? And now you're starting to see new condominiums being built in the South Bronx because Harlem has been oversaturated, and that's the next logical point. And I could say, and I'm glad that you're joining our board because this is not a moment for us, it's a movement. We recently had the opportunity to award a $278 million contract to an Hispanic-owned business that's located in the South Bronx called Century, who is going to provide transportation services for us. So what did that do? We are going to be creating jobs in the South Bronx because of this taxpayer-driven contract that we awarded. We also diversify our core business of what? Transportation. So you're joining a movement. And yes, getting less than 1% of contracts from the city of New York is a crime, but I am confident in Eric Adams, our new mayor, who has said that he wants to leave a legacy of creating wealth in the Black community, Hispanic community, and Asian community. And I have all the confidence in the world that he's going to do just that. But the cost of maintaining the status quo leads to a record number of shootings, a record number of assaults, and we need to come up with a solution that's going to bring parity to our system, which is going to allow everyone to enter the middle class and the mainstream in this great city, state, and country that we live in.
Absolutely, thank you. And maybe I'll ask a little bit of a follow-up question, which is let's put a little bit of a time dimension to it. I mean, we are living in a world where the news cycle is going so fast, maybe I'll just have each one of you share sort of your sense in terms of thinking about what happened, say, before the pandemic and over the last year, and this year, presently. What are some of the changes that you're seeing in terms of people's attitude? The people think about both the broader issue of inequalities and so on and so forth, as well as allyship. So put a little bit of a time dimension to it, if you will, in your thinking.
So, you know, we talk about George Floyd as a benchmark, but in this city, we had a situation where a cousin of mine was killed by a law enforcement officer in Staten Island, J Garner. We didn't learn anything from that. It took the family 4 years to get the officer fired, when in fact the officer should have been arrested. 4 years. The George Floyd moment resulted in those officers being fired, indicted within 1 week. That's the lesson that was learned from Eric Garner to George Floyd. And now you're seeing everyone in corporate America trying to figure out solutions as to how we bring parity. You have Jamie Dimon focusing on urban America and funding various initiatives. Everyone is trying to figure out and eradicate something that's been going on in this country for years. Why does it take a horrific act for everybody to wake up and say, hey, listen, we need to pause, we need to talk to each other, and we need to come up with solutions that's going to allow us to eradicate racism, to allow us to build equity. But I will just end by saying that I was in Buffalo. I was down by SUNY Buffalo 2 weeks ago. And I rented a car and I went over to Jefferson Avenue where the top supermarket was. And the media was there in droves. I mean, this crime of having your grandmother or your mother or your husband or your children go to a grocery store at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and lose their life. I mean, how horrific is that? You know, and then having the issue in Texas that happened last week. But now the media is leaving Buffalo and they're going to Texas, and the issues in Buffalo are not resolved yet. but it's like we're bouncing around from one tragedy to the next tragedy. So we just need to get this right, because we cannot live in a country where there's the have versus the have-nots, because we will never live in peace if we don't fix the racism that we are experiencing right now, because there will never be peace.
I think that the moment is right now. If we're talking about trying to get some sort of like a timeline, right? If we're trying to get some sort of like a timeline, the timeline for this allyship and working together is right now. We see what is happening right now with reproductive rights and what's going to happen for the rest of the country. We're seeing it with what is going to be, what I consider is going to be the next frontier of taking civil rights away from people is going to be the LGBTQ community. We need to start talking about intersectionality, allyship. We need to work together, because the fact is that if we cannot get conversations about gun control in Congress or try to get some sort of consensus right now at the federal level, it has to be on the ground movement, our communities working together, demanding that our communities need to be protected, and that this is not going to be like, but don't worry because this is not affecting you. No, it's going to affect all of us. So the moment is right now. And as I mentioned to you before, there's this urge for everyone to basically say, I'm over this pandemic. I want to go to pre-pandemic times. Let's just go to exotic vacations. Let's just forget about anything. But the fact is that we need to this is the opportunity now to try to move forward and to really counter the hate and the efforts from many segments of our community that wants to limit or even eradicate some of the progress that we have had since, right? And let's say it, all of this emboldening that people have started because we elected a black president. And since then, there has been these targeted approaches basically saying we cannot continue being replaced. We cannot continue let these communities continue to gain ground when the reality is like by all of us being uplifted together, it is for the betterment of this country, for the economic, those mom and pops, the small businesses, for everything. The moment is right now. We cannot wait 5 years to try to just get these goals.
Yeah, for me, I don't think it's so much, moments, but I do want to go back to, when you talked about the civil rights movement. I think the Asian American community has to realize, yes, while there were Asian American leaders who fought with Dr. King, the rights that we gained came from the black community. The fact that we got to vote came from the work of the black community. We need to understand that. And I think it was Julian Bonds who, said, the NAACP pitched this tent, and everybody was welcome. And when things got tough, people left. And I think we need to figure out how do we get back in there to do the hard work, because as Frankie said, everything is under attack. For me, it's not so much a pinpoint of, moments. I think my observation and my critique, to be honest, it's the importance of social media has taken, right? There are days when I'm looking at my Facebook, my Instagram, my Twitter. I don't have a Twitter account, so please don't tag me on anything. It's my office takes care of that. But I feel like my brain is going to explode at any given moment because there's so much information. And the problem with that is because I think we have lost the ability to do critical thinking, to sit and read and think about things, because we just go from like tragedy to tragedy to tragedy. And it's so hard to figure out what's going on. There was a shooting yesterday at church. There was a shooting in Wisconsin. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, how do we keep track of all of this stuff? And we have just become so desensitized to what we're seeing. And that's what really worries me. And I don't think anybody, and we are like drinking all of this like fast 2-second read. There are some articles that I'm reading. It literally says, time to read, how long it's going to take you to read this article, 2 minutes. Something like, I can read it, I'm smart enough to read a 20-minute article. I can read a 2-hour article, right? But they tell you it's going to take 2 minutes. we have lost the ability to sit, read, process, and develop critical thinking skills. So now media gets to tell us to move from issue to issue to issue to issue. So we've just become like nothing is deep, like we're just superficial. There's no root to anything. And where I saw this play out in our own community was, like reporters would call me and say, well, we haven't heard anything, we haven't seen any videos on the news. Aren't you glad Asian hate crimes is over? And I have said to them, just because it's not televised doesn't mean that we're safe, right? You just moved on to something else, right?
But underreporting.
Exactly. And it was like, maybe it's true, the revolution is not going to be televised. But I think we take this revolution where we need to take it and have very honest conversations. But I think I ask all the young people to, social media is important because sometimes that's how we get news, but don't rely on that because that is it's just like a little blip in time and it takes our attention away from developing real empathy for people, empathy for issues, caring deeply about what is happening, because we're just moving from this to this to this to this. And I'm thinking this week I'm thinking, how many shootings am I keeping track of? What am I looking at? Because it's, now we've moved from Buffalo, but it was and then, we think about the kids who died, now there's something else. And it is just never ending. And I think we need to be able to process what all of this means and how we process information and to be able to develop deep critical thinking and empathy skills.
And I would say also that there's been a deliberate campaign in this country and society to pit blacks against Hispanics, Hispanics against Asians, Asians against blacks.
By design.
And we talk about the civil rights movement. Dr. King lost his life when he started focusing on human rights as opposed to civil rights, and when he brought together the Poor People's Campaign. Mm-hmm. Now here's a civil rights leader who flew to Memphis, Tennessee, to campaign with the black sanitation workers who were striking for a living wage, and lost his life, assassinated because he spoke out against the Vietnam War. He spoke out against the status quo. He tried to bring all groups together and lost his life because he was a threat to the status quo. And you're right. I mean, our kids, and we need to know history because we understand that this country was formed because of a rebellion against the British tea tax, right? And the second person who was killed was a black person. And so when I hear rhetoric like, make America great again, or we want our country back, I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, we've been here since almost day one.
We built this country.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so, John, thank God for you and others like you who are going to bring us together, and we're going to eradicate racism, and we're going to change the status quo. I'm confident in that.
Thank you for that. So let's shift gear a little bit and think about some of the practical matters and practical barriers to be specific. And I'm asking you, what are some of the practical barriers that you see to allyship and the new majority coalition building, and how do we overcome them? And I know some of you talk about some of these barriers in the communities and so on, and talked about replacement theory and some of the words that's out there in the mass media. And so in terms of some of these practical barriers, maybe we could think a little bit about something that we have encountered, and also do you see any kind of current systems and policies that may be divisive for our new majority communities, and that actually cause some of the barriers that may or may not be visible to us in that way. So, anything that you have observed and want to share, this is.
I would say, you know what, people are always shocked. We're, the Asian American Federation, we're the demographics experts for the Asian community in New York State. And when I tell people, some of the poorest New Yorkers are Asians, people always say, no, right? Like, no. We're poor. But we also have the fastest growing senior population, the poorest senior population, the highest limited English proficiency. There are a lot, our community is a community in need. And when I think about that, I think about where's the solidarity, where are when you draw the Venn diagram, what is that middle where all the pieces join? And that is about our work to protect vulnerable people, right? No matter who you are, you need to have resources to be able to have shelter, to eat, to be able to feel safe in your neighborhood. That's not just an Asian thing. That's not just a Latino, white, black thing. That's human thing. And I feel like those are the things that we have in common. Our work is really to elevate draw the curtains back for sure, Frankie, because literally at this point, like when all of this started, everybody's like, let's go back to normal. And I said, well, I don't want to go back to normal because normal will never work for us, right? Mm-hmm. And so like, what's the new plan, right? Like mm-hmm. we're not in a rush to get back to whatever people think normal was because it marginalized us. It left us without resources, but there are things that we have in common. And that is the great poverty, the fact that we are always working from 20 paces behind. So maybe we need to work together to figure out how do we pull together to be able to get together. And Frankie and I have lived by this. It is like, it's one or, it's not one or the other, it's we go together, right? That's the mentality that we need to continue to develop. And that is something that that has to be lived experience so that way, when corporations come to us and say, it's going to be you or you, we have said, no, it's together. And I think that's something that we have to consciously practice so that way it just becomes habit, that they know that, the great powers, the empire will not come to us to say, you're gonna have to pick and choose, right? But I think the shared goal for all of our work as human beings is to help to alleviate human misery and human suffering. And that we need to start to think about beyond, race, beyond language, beyond, color, religion, neighborhoods. If you look at, some of the most underserved neighborhoods in New York, it's black neighborhoods. But there's also a lot of Asian Americans that move into them because of the fact that they're poor too, but yet they're divided by language, so they don't even know how to help each other, right? These are the conversations that I'm having with my black elders. Hey, people call me and say, hey, I have a growing Asian American community. They're elders. They look really afraid given the news. What can we do to help them? Because we don't want our neighbors to be afraid. These are conversations that are happening organically. People are starting to realize and their eyes are opening. And I think this, maybe through all of this tragedy of the pandemic, J Garner, anti-Asian violence, the violence that is so prevalent that to be honest, I feel like we're kind of normalizing all this gun violence that is happening. We need to be able to center the work that to be a little existential. The reason why we're really here is to not be okay by ourselves. You don't live in this, as my father, the minister, says, you don't live in this planet by yourself. You don't live in this world by yourself. You need to help other people. You need to look at other people. You need to work together. And that is really the charge that I think we have as human beings. Yes, I support the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. Barber is leading now. I know that, I understand that. There are a lot of young Asian Americans who are working on that because that's ultimately what we need to get to. I love that saying about, rising tide lifts all boats. Right now, the work is, as Frankie said, all the Black, Latino, Asian people during pandemic who had to go to work because they were poor and they didn't have the resources to stay home. Like, how do we start to think about that and to be able to fight for systems that elevate every single community out of poverty to be able to look beyond color. Because my solidarity isn't just with my community. My work isn't just with my community. It is with anybody who, my work is centered in leading a community that we can understand and work together with other marginalized communities.
And when we're talking about the obstacles, right, the challenges, for me personally, and it's a little bit of what you mentioned before, it is about so many issues. And by design, again, the system wants to pin us against each other to compete for limited resources, limited funding, limited opportunities. So sometimes what I need is that text from you basically saying, like, do you know that this conversation is happening and they are not including the Hispanic community, right? Or Michael and John coming together and said, like, we need to really speak up about this, because sometimes we are so focused on the problem of the day, on the need from the community. You're so overwhelmed. We get, for example, in the Latinx community, only less than 1% of foundation funds, if you think about it. We need to have the 007s of each one of these communities basically giving us intel about what's happening in many of these conversations, in many of these rooms that we are excluded. And that is why it was so important when the city was trying to do a response around food insecurity, and our conversation was like, where is the culturally competent aspect of these meals? And we were to town, and we were like, we're going to fight for this, because our communities are not going to be served properly if there is not the culturally competency in this service, in taking into consideration that. So the obstacle is, the needs of our community that are so grave, but at the same time, the opportunity is that we can learn and feed each other all of this information so that we can be more effective when we advocate for not only our community, but for our communities as well.
And the point that you made, Psychology 101, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, safety, and shelter is a basic right and a basic need that we all need in order for us to flourish. But in this post-George Floyd moment, we tell corporations all the time that we don't want your sympathy money. We want to establish a mutual beneficial relationship, whereas theirs wins on both sides of the equation. And so when Frankie and John and I, the 100 Black men in our respective organizations, had the ability to dispense grants from a grant that we received from Hennessy, that we empowered the Black, Asian, Hispanic communities, that was a great thing. That wasn't sympathy money. That was money that they hired us to identify businesses and give them grant money during COVID-19.
Trusting us to do it.
Absolutely.
Because we know our community best.
Absolutely. And guess what happened? We just finalized round 3, and now we're going to focus on round 4. And our recommendation to them is going to be, as opposed to the $7,500 grant, let's give $10,000 grants. Because $10,000 is going to make a difference for a small business that's been impacted or adversely impacted by COVID-19. And so give us the opportunity. I don't want your sympathy money. Give us the opportunity to bring Black, Hispanic, and Asian businesses to your door so they can do business. Don't give us sympathy money. We don't want it. Give us the ability to empower our businesses so they can hire people, so they can grow.
Thank you. So when I was asked to moderate this panel, the organizer told me that at the beginning of the panel, you probably don't want to engage the audience too much because they may not be awake yet. But now I hope you're all awake. We're going to open up a little bit of a question from the audience. If you have anything you would like to ask any of us or all of us, please just raise your hand and ask away. All right, I see a couple of hands up.
So thank you all for what you do. And Dr. Wu, I actually studied Baruch on weekends, getting my MPA.
All right.
But my question to you all is history enough, or does everyone in school, in high school, need a class on public policy, right? Because just history alone probably doesn't get us there, right? Do we all need to learn more about public policy? This way we could participate more in the political process?
For our organization, Civic Engagement, I will say that instead of public policy, I will call it more civic engagement. It is critically important. We know that young people in this country are starting to create a new movement, especially around the gun violence and what has been happening in schools around the country. But there is so much that needs to be done to engage people in participating and understanding their rights and understanding how important it is for them to participate in the political process. So absolutely, I think that we need to do more. We need to find more ways to engage young people earlier. I mean, if we pick up the phone and called for our favorite American Idol person and we don't make that connection that's like your vote counts for things that you really care about, we're failing our youth. So absolutely. And that is why for our organizations, civic engagement is one of the most important pillars of the work that we do.
For us too, absolutely. Asians are always, we've seen some really high profile controversies in the Asian American community, especially Chinatown with the jail, right? That first jail got built because, the mayor said, put it in Chinatown, put the jail in Chinatown. Chinese people, they don't vote, right? Our community has a terrible track record of voting, right? And for me, I feel like, man, if I have to vote every single week, if I have to go vote for a dog catcher, I'm gonna do it, right? Just to get that uptick of the Asian number. But it is so shocking. But there's a reason why, because I studied the Pew report about the Asian American sentiment. And this is a challenge for the policymakers, the elected officials. Asian American young people who are eligible to vote say they don't vote because they feel like they're not part of the process and they're not invited in, right? And so that's something that the parties are gonna have to realize. But for our community, I feel like, hell, if they're not inviting us in, kick the door down, right? Go out, there is nothing preventing you from registering and going out to vote. To tell people, because that is the most powerful way you tell people who are elected to serve you that you're not happy, that everybody is replaceable, right? That is the greatest contribution I think that you make to this country, is by going and exercising your right to vote. And every time you vote, think about all the people who don't have that right in this country. But that is you're lending to the very important public policy discourse by doing something so simple. We have a primary election coming up in New York. We have 50,000 elections coming up because it's all so confusing with all the new redistricting and all of this stuff. But pay attention to what is happening and go out there and participate and be part of the solution. Be part of the solution.
And a point is well taken with voting, because there's a movement in this country now to not renew the Voting Rights Act. And what's going to happen is this, and one of my mentors, a guy by the name of Al Van, who used to be a former state assemblyman and a city councilman out of Brooklyn, and he always said that if someone in your home is not voting, call NYPD and have them arrested. Because, there's been so many people in this country who have lost their lives simply trying to vote in the South. And so civic engagement, history is key. There's a lot of history that's not taught in our institutions of higher learning that should be taught, because now our younger generations, they think and they feel that this whole civil rights movement started with them, and they don't know history. If they knew history, they would be better equipped to deal deal with aspects and force impacts and positive outcomes And so, yes, civil engagement and history in our institutions of higher learning.
Thank you, and thank you for that great question, typical of a Baruch student. I think we have time for maybe one more from the audience. I saw a couple hands up before.
Since I have the mic, I guess I will be the second person to ask the question. My name is Dottie Lee from Washington, D.C. My company's name is Trans-Pacific Communications. It's great to see you, Joanne. My question has to do with Joanne's comments and Michael's and of course, Frankie's, that you all talked about something that's central to the core of our business, which is cross-cultural communication. You mentioned that people don't go to vote, but are these ballots translated into the languages? The food's not served culturally competently. Are those people, the officials, the community leaders, the organizers, are they aware of certain foods that we shun from, that we can't eat those foods, right? And are they understanding this? It goes back to a small incident, which could be so grand in the scheme of things. We started to translate all the COVID materials from the SBA. If you look up the SBA website, all the materials in COVID, PPP loans, EIDL loans, restaurant revitalization, all those, we translated them into 200 plus languages. But when we first started doing that, it was a huge contract, by the way, $4.1 million. But when we first started, a very high-level senior official from SBA who said this to me, I quote, she said, I had no idea these materials need to be translated into Gujarati, Hindi, Chinese, and Marshallese and Chukis and Tongan and Samoan and so on and so forth. She had no idea those things need to be conveyed into different languages so our communities could get the loans we need. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done to our public leaders and communities and so on and so forth. So how do we do that to engage people so they understand we need to get a piece of the pie? Through whatever means, translation, through education, awareness, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to throw this out there.
I think Frankie and my work together has always centered language access and culturally, and they say culturally competent, and I was like, could we move beyond competence at this point, right? Can we get to like relevance and expertise? But that has always been the center of our work. And the other language, as we talk about, one of the fastest growing languages that I want to put, raise awareness is African languages. African immigrant community is fast growing. They have different language needs too. So right now, the Federation is working on creating a language bank to use the expertise of the local speakers to not use language line, not to have clunky system, to be able to hire within our own communities after we train them to be able to translate. But language is always key. And listen, if something is not right and we find out about it, those calls are getting made to City Hall, right? Trust me. We have had many, many very hard conversations, right? But it comes from people letting us know, right? Because that's the other challenge. Like oftentimes we're like, what? We didn't know that, right? Because any given day we're working on 50,000 things, but yeah, when people call us, when one of my member agencies called and said, look at what the Brooklyn Chinese seniors are getting to eat for the home delivery meal, bag of potato chips, 2 apples, and a bag of carrots. I wish I was kidding. She sent pictures. So I had to call and say, what the F, right? Like, and it was like, oh, but we're panicked, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, this is all I hear, right? And yeah, we forced them to be better, to be like, if you can't do the contract, then give it to one of the Asian groups that can actually take care of these things. This is something that we lived through the pandemic. This is something we live through every day, every single day. This is the fight that we're having.
And that is why, for example, the work that Michael does is so important, because the fact is that if you don't have people hired at all different levels, diverse group of people, they are not going to let that person tell you, it's just like, oh, I didn't know that this needs to be translated, right? You need to My personal case, the Federation at the time when it was founded in 1990 started working very closely on HIV/AIDS prevention and awareness. That was what it was devastating our community at the time, and that was our approach to LGBTQ issues. But when I was hired, some other members that are from the Latinx LGBTQ community were starting to be hired at the Federation and being empowered to be part of the conversations. We started talking about we need to expand and not be pigeonholed on just AIDS for our community work and LGBTQ. We need to talk about Latinx LGBTQ in a more intersectional way. And we started talking about marriage equality, and we started to talk about the intersectionality and making sure that our work also included the LGBTQ community in a more effective way. So that wouldn't have happened necessarily if the Federation at the time didn't have the vision of saying, like, we need to start having more conversations. We need to have more diverse team members, even within our own community, to be able to have these conversations. However, what I hear a lot when we're having these conversations is like, we cannot find candidates. We cannot find qualified, diverse candidates. And that is also something that we need to reject every single time and say, like, the candidates exist, you're not looking in the right places, right? And the problem that I have sometimes is that they want to poach my staff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because they say, we cannot find anybody, so we're going to take people away from you or from the nonprofit sector. And also that destabilizes us. Great opportunities for some people, but it destabilizes us. Although we are always working on creating that pipeline. For our organizations, the capacity building and creating that pipeline is super important. And if you don't find your candidates, create the programs to get those candidates in. Right now, there is a shortage of pilots, and the airlines are starting to train and create these schools for people to be trained and not have to go from the Army, from the Air Force to being pilots, commercial pilots. We need to tell people, it's like, this is not on us. This is also on you. You need to find the pipeline and not have these ignorant conversations. Like, how is it possible? And also, we need to fight back constantly about this. The Federation was involved in a lawsuit in Florida, in a specific county that did not think that it was important to have ballots in other languages but English. And we won. But the problem is that we need to do this and be doing it in so many different places. But what we need to basically say, and I'm glad that you were able to do that contract, because it is critically important, especially for in times of crisis. I'm telling you, I'm still learning English. If I read something in Spanish, I will better absorb it, and I will be able to understand it better than if I have to read something super complicated in English. So it's thank you for the work that you do.
And last but not least, we started out by saying, in the words of Bob Marley, when you stand up for your rights, you must vote, because when you vote and your candidates get in, they listen. And a prime example of that is Bill Thompson, the former city controller of this city of New York, now is the chairman of the CUNY Board of Trustees. He had a mandate. His mandate was to diversify the system. So now we have a chancellor, the first Hispanic chancellor of CUNY, and guess what? We have an Asian president of one of the most prestigious colleges in the country. When you vote, great things happen.
Wait, thank you. I think that now we have a soundtrack for the conference, so we need to start playing those songs at the networking section.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure you are all as energized as I am to hear from the leaders of the communities that represents the allyship that we're talking about here today. And as I started this panel by saying, really, what this is about is how do we strengthen this ecosystem of leadership that make the movement possible. And thank you all for being here, and thank you, John, for putting us together, and have a great conference. Thank you.
Panelists, another round of applause. Fantastic job. Fantastic. Test. So some really powerful insights from this panel. I was taking copious notes. Let me share with you some of my my takeaways from this panel. A couple of direct quotes from Anne. For society to be better, we must stand together. Also from Anne, and she said this more than once. When we go together. Frankie, there are no simple solutions to complex problems. Michael, when we talk to each other, not at each other, we have the opportunity to make a better society. From Michael, if someone in your home's not voting, have them arrested. From Anne, if I have to vote for a dog catcher, I'll vote for a dog catcher. And last but not least, and he'll appreciate this from Dr. Wu, great questions come from Baruch students. I want to give a shout out as well to Dottie Lee. Dottie's out there somewhere, but I caught your post. There she is, Dottie. Oh, you were the one that asked the question. I should have made that connection. Give Dottie a round of applause because she posted on Twitter and got a great picture of the panel. Thank you. You got your hashtags, you got your picture. I think you got one of me too. I'm going to send that to my family. So I appreciate that very much. Please do post to social media. I'm going to agree with Ann. We shouldn't necessarily get our news, but we can certainly get our updates from social media. So please, as I mentioned before, channel those hashtags, AABR 2022, AABDC 2022, and hashtag new majority. So at this juncture, we're going to take a break, and let me give you some instructions. You can find refreshments in the lobby area from where you entered the room. I will remind you that we have volunteers who are prepared and willing and able to help you if you need any assistance. Please give yourself enough time to network, to fellowship, to get to know one another. We're going to try to get back here right at 11 o'clock. So we've got just under 15 minutes for a break. So I'll see you back on the mark at 11 o'clock, and we will continue the dialogue. Thank you.